Latin American Studies is an academic field dealing with the study of Latin America and Latin Americans. Definition: Latin American Studies critically examines the history, culture, politics, and experiences of Latin Americans in Latin America and often also elsewhere. Latin American Studies is interdisciplinary from numerous disciplines such as sociology, history, literature, political science, geography, gender studies, and economics. Latin Americanists consider a variety of perspectives and employ diverse analytical tools in the work. Though Latin America is a fluid concept, with no fixed definition, Latin American Studies is usually quite open and often includes or is closely associated with, for instance, Latino Studies, Caribbean Studies, and Transatlantic Studies. The Latin American Studies Association, for instance, has sections dealing with Europe and Latin America, Haiti, and Latino Studies. History: Latin America has been studied in one way or another ever since Columbus's voyage of 1492, and even before. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientist explorers such as Alexander von Humboldt published extensively about the region. Towards the end of the 19th century and at the turn of the 20th, within the region itself, writers such as José Martí and José Enrique Rodo encouraged a consciousness of regional identity. In 1875, the International Congress of Americanists held its first meeting in Nancy, France, and has met regularly ever since, alternating between venues in Europe and in the Western Hemisphere. However, unlike the scholarly organizations of the 20th century, the ICA does not have an ongoing organization, nor is there a journal of the ICA. The creation of formal and ongoing scholarly organizations focusing on Latin America is a product of the 20th century. In the U.S., historians with an interest in Latin American history within the American Historical Association created a group focusing on Latin America. In 1918, they founded the Hispanic American Historical Review, which has published quarterly since that time and has built a reputation as one of the premier scholarly journals. The Latin Americanists within the AHA created the Conference on Latin American History in 1926, which is now separately incorporated, but continues to coordinate its annual meetings with the American Historical Association. In 1936, U.S. Latin Americanists also founded the Handbook of Latin American Studies, with editorial offices in the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress. In a pre-digital era, a compilation of annotated bibliographic references in the humanities and social science organized by subject and country was a vital tool for scholars in the field. With the Cuban Revolution of 1959, the U.S. government began seriously focusing on Latin America as Cuba and the hemisphere was seen to be an integral element of Cold War politics. The Latin American historian who wrote the early history of the founding of the Latin American Studies Association Riley suggested in 1966 that at some future date Latin Americanists should erect a statue of Fidel Castro, the remote godfather of the field who instigated a renewed U.S. interest in the region. Interest in Latin American studies increased starting in the 1950s. In the U.S., Latin American studies was boosted by the passing of Title V of the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which provided resources for centers of area and international studies. In the UK, the 1965 Parry Report provided similar impetus for the establishment of institutes and centers of Latin American studies at Oxford, London, Cambridge, and Liverpool. In Canada, your York University in Toronto established the first Latin American center, in part thanks to the inflow of exiled intellectuals from South America. Germany's Ibero-Americanisches Institute in Berlin had been founded in 1930, but not until the 1970s did it experience expansion. Associations: Brazilian Studies Association, Canadian Association for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Consortium of Latin American Studies Programs, Latin American Studies Association, Mid-Atlantic Council of Latin American Studies, Pacific Coast Council of Latin American Studies, Rocky Mountain Council for Latin American Studies, Seminar on the Acquisition of Latin American Library Materials, established 1967. Society for Irish Latin American Studies, Society for Latin American Studies, established 1964. Southeast Council of Latin American Studies, Journals, The Americas, established 1944. Bulletin of Latin American Research, established 1981. Canadian Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, established 1976. Colonial Latin American Historical Review, established 1992. Colonial Latin American Review, established 1992. European Review of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, the Hispanic American Historical Review, established 1918, published by Conference on Latin American History. Historia Mexicana, established 1951. Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, established 1996. Journal of Latin American Studies, established 1969. Journal of Politics in Latin America, Latin American Perspectives, established in 1974. Latin American Politics and Society, Latin American Research Review, The Latin Americanist, published by Wiley Blackwell and the Southeast Council of Latin American Studies, Mexican Studies, Estudios Mexicanos, NACLA Report on the Americas, Problems of Latin America, Programs, the University of Texas at Austin, Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies, Austin, Texas, Roger Thayer Stone Center for Latin American Studies at Tulane University, Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at Indiana University, Center for Latin American Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Michigan Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos, Mexico, Latin America, Caribbean and U.S. Latino Studies, University at Albany, State University of New York, Albany, New York, Ibero-American Institute, Berlin, Institute of Latin American Studies, London, University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies, University of California, Los Angeles Latin American Center, University of California, Santa Barbara Latin American and Iberian Studies Program, University of New Mexico, Latin American and Iberian Institute, Latin American Studies Division, CCUS and LAST School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India, Center for Latin American Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, Goa University, Panaji, Goa, India. Research libraries and archives outside Latin America. Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley. Benson Latin American Collection, University of Texas Library, Austin, Texas. Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Paris. John Carter Brown Library, Providence, Rhode Island. Center for Research Libraries, Dumbarton Oaks, Washington, D.C. Hispanic Society of America, New York City. Huntington Library, San Marino, California. Library of Congress, Washington, D.C. Newberry Library, Chicago. Oliveira Lima Library, Catholic University, Washington, D.C., Tulane University Library, New Orleans, Louisiana, University of Florida Library, Gainesville, Florida, Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, Santa Barbara, CA. British Libraries. Some notable Latin Americanists. See also category, Latin Americanists Library Guides for Latin American Studies. Latin American Studies. Research Guides. Los Angeles, University of California, Latin American and AMP, Caribbean Studies. Lab Guides. USA, Duke University. Latin American Studies. Library Guides. USA, Johns Hopkins University. Latin American and Caribbean Studies. Research Guides. Coral Gables, Florida, University of Miami. Latin American and AMP, Caribbean Studies. Research Guides. USA, University of Michigan. Latin American Studies. Research Guides. USA, New York University. Latin American Studies. Lab Guides. Evanston, Illinois, USA, Northwestern University Library. Latin American Studies. Oxford Lab Guides. Oxford, UK, University of Oxford, Bodleian Libraries. Latin America, Spain and Portugal. Princeton Lab Guides. USA, Princeton University Library. University Libraries. Latin American Studies. Research Guides. New Jersey, USA, Rutgers University.